Something just shifted in the global order, and most people completely missed it. Two of America's most loyal allies, countries that have fought alongside the United States in every major conflict since World War II, have just done something that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Australia and Canada are formalizing a bilateral strategic alliance that deliberately excludes Washington. Let that sink in. These are not rogue states. These are not adversaries. These are the two nations that share intelligence with the United States at the deepest classified levels through the Five Eyes network. These are countries whose soldiers have died on the same battlefields as American troops, and they are now building a framework to operate without American leadership. The architects of this shift are not panicking. They are calm, deliberate, and they have been planning this for longer than most analysts will admit. The question you need to ask yourself is not whether this is happening. The data is clear. It is happening right now. The question is why the mainstream conversation is treating this like a minor diplomatic footnote when it is actually one of the most consequential realignments in the post-war international order. We are going to answer that question today, every layer of it. To understand why Australia and Canada are doing this, you have to stop looking at this event in isolation, because the truth they are hiding, the thing that nobody in the cable news cycle wants to say out loud, is that this alliance did not form because of one tweet, one tariff announcement, or one uncomfortable phone call. This has three roots, and each one reaches deeper than the last. In early 2025, the Trump administration reimposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under Section 232, a provision originally designed for national security threats. Canada was not classified as a threat. It was classified as an ally, but it was treated like one anyway. The Canadian government under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who came into office with a reputation as one of the most sophisticated economic minds ever to hold that office, responded with calibrated precision. Ottawa did not beg for an exemption. It began systematically reducing its economic dependency on American supply chains. Canada fast-tracked trade agreements with the United Kingdom, expanded its existing CETA framework with the European Union, and quietly opened preferential commodity channels with Japan and South Korea. But here is what most analysts missed. Simultaneously, Canada's Department of Finance began running internal models on what full economic decoupling from the United States would look like over a 10-year horizon. That is not the behavior of a country negotiating. That is the behavior of a country planning an exit. AUKUS, the trilateral security pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, was announced in 2021 as the cornerstone of Indo-Pacific security architecture. The centerpiece of that deal was American nuclear submarine technology being transferred to Australia. But in 2025, that transfer began hitting serious delays. American shipyards, already stretched thin meeting the U.S. Navy's own procurement demands, could not meet the production timelines promised to Canberra. The Pentagon's own internal assessments, portions of which were leaked to Australian media, suggested that the first submarine delivery could slip by as many as 7 years beyond the original schedule. 7 years. For Australia, this is not an abstract policy inconvenience. This is an existential timeline problem. China's People's Liberation Army Navy has been commissioning submarines at a rate that has no historical precedent in peacetime. By 2030, analysts at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute project that China will have more than 80 nuclear-capable submarines operational in the Indo-Pacific theater. Australia was promised a deterrent. What it is receiving is a delay. And when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese raised these concerns formally in Washington, the response from the Trump administration was, according to sources familiar with the discussions, dismissive. The framing from the American side was essentially, you are lucky to be in this deal at all. That response changed the calculation in Canberra permanently. Now, here is the connection that almost nobody is drawing, and this is where the hidden architecture of this Australia-Canada alliance becomes unmistakably clear. The Arctic is melting, not metaphorically, physically. Sea ice coverage in the Arctic has declined by approximately 13% per decade since satellite monitoring began. By conservative scientific projections, the Arctic Ocean will see its first ice-free summer sometime between 2030 and 2040. That opens entirely new shipping lanes that cut the distance between Asia and Europe by 40% compared to existing routes through the Suez Canal. Canada controls the Northwest Passage. Russia controls the Northern Sea Route. And there is no enforceable international legal framework that definitively governs these waterways. In January 2025, Donald Trump made a statement that escalated this from a geopolitical ambiguity to a direct threat. He suggested that American control over Greenland was a national security necessity. And separately, in what Canadian officials described as a non-trivial comment, he implied that Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage could be subject to American national interest determinations. That was the moment the Australia-Canada alliance stopped being theoretical. Canada needs a strategic partner with naval capability, economic weight, and shared democratic values who is not going to use Arctic resources as a bargaining chip. Australia, despite being in the Southern Hemisphere, has enormous interest in Arctic shipping routes because they directly affect the cost of Australian commodity exports to European markets. These three events, the tariff war, the AUKUS delay, and the Arctic sovereignty challenge, are not separate stories. They are one story, told in 3 chapters. And when you read them together, the Australia-Canada alliance does not look like a reaction. It looks like an inevitability. Understanding who is actually driving this realignment requires looking beyond the press releases and the diplomatic handshakes. Mark Carney is not a conventional politician. He is a former Goldman Sachs executive, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, and a man who spent years at the highest levels of international financial governance before entering elected politics. When Carney talks about Canadian economic sovereignty, he is not playing to a domestic audience. He is signaling to bond markets, to institutional investors, and to foreign governments simultaneously. His language is precise because imprecision costs money, a lesson he learned managing systemic risk during the 2008 global financial crisis. Carney's response to Trump's tariffs was not angry. It was structural. He began repositioning Canada not as a country seeking American favor, but as a country offering an alternative investment destination for capital that was growing nervous about American policy stability. That is a sophisticated play, and it has been working. Foreign direct investment inquiries into Canada rose significantly in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024, with notable interest from European and East Asian institutional funds. Australia's Prime Minister Albanese operates in a political environment that is genuinely different from almost any other Western democracy. His country sits at the geographic intersection of the Indo-Pacific's most intense power competition. China is Australia's largest trading partner. The United States is Australia's primary security guarantor. And managing that contradiction has been the defining challenge of Australian foreign policy for 2 decades. The AUKUS submarine delay did not just embarrass Albanese domestically. It exposed the fundamental vulnerability of a security architecture entirely dependent on American delivery. Albanese's strategic response has been to diversify. Australia has expanded defense cooperation with Japan under a new reciprocal access agreement. It has deepened intelligence sharing with India. It has committed to accelerating its own sovereign shipbuilding capacity, a decision that costs more in the short term, but reduces dependency in the long term. The Australia-Canada bilateral framework fits perfectly into this pattern. It gives Albanese a partner that shares democratic values, Five Eyes intelligence access, and a genuine interest in maintaining rules-based international order, without requiring American permission or American participation. Here is where it gets genuinely complicated for Washington. The Pentagon does not want this alliance, not because it is hostile to American interests, but because it represents a model of security architecture that functions independently of American leadership. If Australia and Canada can build a credible bilateral framework without Washington, other allies will notice. And some of those allies have been quietly having very similar conversations. Senior U.S. military officials have reportedly expressed concern through back channels that this realignment risks fragmenting the integrated command structures that Western military forces have spent 70 years building. The value of NATO, of Five Eyes, of the hub-and-spoke alliance system is interoperability. When pieces start operating on different tracks, the system becomes less efficient. But here is the strategic irony. It is American policy choices, specifically the use of economic coercion against allies and the failure to deliver on defense commitments, that created the conditions for this fragmentation. The Pentagon is dealing with a problem largely manufactured by the political leadership above it. Do not overlook Brussels in this story. The European Union has been watching the Australia-Canada dynamic with intense interest and not passively. EU trade commissioners have been in direct contact with both Canberra and Ottawa about creating coordinated approaches to American tariff policy. The concept being discussed, referred to in internal EU documents as Allied Economic Resilience, essentially proposes that democratic market economies create preferential trading frameworks with each other that reduce the leverage any single dominant economy can exert. This is a direct architectural response to American economic nationalism, and it changes everything about how we should be reading the global trading system going forward. If you are watching this and thinking this is a story about distant politicians making abstract decisions, you need to recalibrate immediately. Because what is happening between Australia, Canada, and the fracturing of the American alliance system has direct, measurable consequences for the price of things you buy, the security of your savings, and the economic conditions your children will inherit. Canada is the largest single supplier of oil to the United States. More than 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. This is not a talking point. This is an infrastructure reality. The pipelines, the refineries, the storage facilities, they were all built around this relationship. If Canada continues to develop alternative export infrastructure, and the Carney government has already fast-tracked new liquefied natural gas export capacity on the West Coast, the cost structure of North American energy changes. American refineries that are currently calibrated for Canadian heavy crude cannot simply switch to lighter grades without significant capital investment. Any meaningful reduction in Canadian oil flowing south does not just hurt Canadian exporters. It creates supply tightness in American markets that gets passed directly to the pump. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has modeled scenarios where even a 15% reduction in Canadian crude imports raises average American gasoline prices by between 18 and 27 cents per gallon over a sustained period. That is not theoretical. That is your commute becoming more expensive. Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore and one of the top 3 exporters of coal and liquefied natural gas. These commodities are foundational inputs for global industrial production. When Australia's trade relationships shift, when Canberra deepens its commodity partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and India in ways that prioritize those relationships over American-aligned pricing structures, it affects global commodity prices. Steel produced from Australian iron ore, processed in Japanese and South Korean facilities, competes directly with American domestic steel production. If the Australia-Canada alliance accelerates commodity trade frameworks that exclude American intermediaries, American steel and aluminum manufacturers face intensified competition at exactly the moment they were counting on tariff protection to provide breathing room. The tariffs designed to protect American industry may end up accelerating the very trade reorientation that undermines it. Here is the dimension that most financial commentators are actively avoiding. The U.S. dollar functions as the world's reserve currency, in large part because of trust. Trust in American institutions, American reliability as a partner, and American commitment to the rules-based international order it largely designed after 1945. When American allies begin building economic frameworks that deliberately route around American economic leverage, they are also incrementally reducing their dependency on dollar-denominated transactions. The Australia-Canada framework includes provisions for bilateral currency swap arrangements. The EU's Allied Economic Resilience concept explicitly discusses euro-denominated commodity contracts. None of this destroys dollar dominance overnight, but the direction is clear and the data is clear. The share of global trade settled in U.S. dollars has been declining slowly but consistently since 2015. Events like this accelerate that trajectory. A declining dollar share in global trade means higher import costs for American consumers, more expensive electronics, more expensive clothing, more expensive pharmaceuticals. It is a slow burn, but it is a real one. Institutional investors, the people managing pension funds, index funds, and sovereign wealth portfolios, are already reacting to this realignment. Canadian markets have seen capital inflows from European institutional investors seeking stable, democratic, rule-of-law environments that are not subject to unpredictable policy shifts. Australian resource stocks have attracted significant interest from East Asian sovereign wealth funds looking to secure commodity access outside of American-aligned frameworks. This means capital that might have flowed into American equities is being redirected. It does not cause an immediate crash, but it contributes to a competitive disadvantage for American capital markets over a 5 to 10-year horizon that affects the long-term returns of every retirement account tied to index funds with American equity exposure. This changes everything about how you should be thinking about portfolio diversification. The global investment map is being redrawn, and most retail investors have no idea it is happening. Based on the trajectory of current events, economic data, and diplomatic signaling, here is what the next 30 days look like with a high degree of analytical confidence. Within the first week, expect formal diplomatic language from the Australian and Canadian governments to become increasingly coordinated. Joint statements on trade, security, and international law will begin appearing with language that is notably parallel, not accidental, but choreographed. Watch for the phrase, rules-based international order, to appear in both governments' communications simultaneously. That is the signal phrase that tells you the coordination is active and deliberate. In the second week, the Trump administration will respond. The response will likely come first through economic pressure. Expect either the threat of additional tariffs on Canadian goods or a pointed statement about reviewing the terms of Australian defense commitments under AUKUS. This is the predictable escalation pattern, and both Canberra and Ottawa have wargamed it. They will not capitulate. The economic modeling has already been done, and both governments have concluded that short-term pain from American economic pressure is preferable to long-term structural dependency. By the third week, watch for European signals. The EU will not formally announce support for the Australia-Canada framework. That would be too provocative. But European trade commissioners will make statements about strengthening economic ties with like-minded democratic partners that are timed in a way that cannot be coincidental. This is diplomatic amplification. It is how multilateral alignment happens without anyone having to call it an alliance. In the fourth week, this is the critical moment. Look at what happens in the bond markets. If the Australia-Canada bilateral currency swap arrangements are formally activated, even on a small scale, you will see a measurable, if modest, reaction in U.S. Treasury yields. The signal will be small. The meaning will be enormous. It will be the first concrete demonstration that allied countries are willing to build financial infrastructure that does not require American participation. The 30-day period will almost certainly end without a dramatic public confrontation. That is precisely the point. This realignment is designed to be incremental, deniable, and structurally durable. The people orchestrating it have learned from history that frontal confrontation with a dominant power rarely succeeds. Architectural substitution, building alternative systems quietly, methodically, until the dominant system becomes optional rather than mandatory, is far more effective, and they are very good at it. Here is the real cost of what you just watched unfold, and it goes beyond any single tariff or any single delayed submarine delivery. The United States built its post-war dominance not primarily through military force, but through the consent of its allies. Countries chose American leadership because American leadership was on balance reliable. It delivered security guarantees. It upheld trade agreements. It maintained the international institutions that allowed smaller countries to operate with dignity and predictability. When that reliability erodes, when allies calculate that building independent frameworks is safer than trusting American commitments, the cost is not just strategic, it is foundational. The infrastructure of American global leadership is built on relationships, and relationships once strained beyond a certain threshold do not simply reset. Australia and Canada are not America's enemies. They are doing what any rational actor does when the environment around them becomes unpredictable. They are hedging. They are building exits. And the fact that two of America's closest, most loyal, most deeply integrated partners feel the need to do this right now is the most important data point in this entire story. The truth they are hiding is simple. This is not a bilateral dispute. This is a referendum on American reliability. And right now, two of its oldest friends are voting with their foreign policies. Here is the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to drop your answer in the comments because this conversation matters. If the countries that have been most loyal to the United States for the longest period of time are now building contingency plans that exclude Washington, what does that tell us about where American global leadership will be, not in 50 years, but in 10? And is there any policy shift that could reverse this, or has something already broken that cannot be repaired? Tell me what you think, because the answer to that question shapes the world your children inherit. If this analysis opened your eyes to something the mainstream media is not covering, share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in the world right now. Subscribe for weekly deep dives that connect the events they report to the consequences they never explain.